Hi.
Hi, I'm Alexa. I chose Italian culture because I am of Italian descent, and my thoughts on the Necronema passage was that it really spoke volumes on how careful you need to be with your words when you are describing the culture of another. Two words that came to my mind specifically was respect and recognition. This passage really showed how messy things can get when you're carelessly throwing words around, and you're not really mindful to how you're wording things. He was wording things just, kind of over the top, very bizarre about the practices and the rituals that community was partaking in. And I just think that kind of paints a clear picture, especially how it depicts Americans, because sometimes we are in our own bubble and it's really easy to judge cultures on the other side of the globe that we feel like we can't relate to, don't really understand. So it's really easy for us to pass judgment because sometimes we get in our own little bubble. And I also thought this article was interesting because it also mentioned time zones and regions and how that fluctuated within culture. So I think that's interesting as well because in America, it's a melting pot, but it's an odd one because in some regions you have it's very rural, there's really nothing there. I feel like in those areas they're not really too exposed to other cultures and that can get in a bubble of itself. Whereas, if you're going to somewhere like New York or LA or Chicago, you're going to see cultures of all kinds. So there's a higher, chance of intercultural literacy in an area like that. Whereas somewhere in like the Midwest where there isn't really much going on. But either way, you just need to be careful about how you word things and describe them to others and just be mindful and have respect. With that being said, my culture in Italy, I did this based on a lot of religious values that really depicted the moral values within the culture and specifically within premarital relations and reproductive rights with women. Back in the day, in the 40s through the 70s even, and still to this day, but not as much anymore thanks to globalization, the Catholic Church was really, really involved in Italian politics, and there was a group known as the Christian Democratic Party. So they kind of had a say, and everything was rooted in the Catholic religion. So at that time, you saw a lot of arranged marriages were really common. Women, everybody was in a rush to get married. And that would happen, in your early 20s. And marriage was looked at in two ways. It was just one, to reproduce, and that's how they saw it. And two, there was a strength on the family unit. That was a huge thing. And you can still see that in the culture very much till this day. Yeah, there's a lot of just family. When you think of Italy, you're thinking of food and you're thinking of family and big Italian families, and that's just how it is. So back in that day, they took it very literally, and the family unit was so strong. And the Catholic Church was doing anything that they could to prevent this from crumbling. And, what would happen back in that day as well, because of this, it would put the male in charge. So there were laws in place, where the male was able to relocate the family and the woman did not have a say. Divorce was allowed, but it was extremely frowned upon. And if you were a woman and you were coming out of divorce, you were kind of casted out from the community and frowned upon. There was also a law in place that once you were divorced, you were not allowed to remarry at that time. And then there was another value that was really strong during that era, which was you could not have a child out of wedlock. That just wasn't really a thing, and abortions were frowned upon extremely by the church. So at this point in time, women really didn't have a say. There was really no sense of individual rights. And you saw a lot of that, again, how that manifested with men being able to relocate, the woman could not. There were other inequalities within men and women during that time, but they were so focused on the family unit that just could not break. So how did this change? It changed over time throughout history. Its really big moment was thanks to the women's suffrage movement in the 60s. The impact of the globalization of this movement really impacted the women, the young women, in Italy. And there's this one woman I want to quote. Her name is Franca Falucci, and she was a member of the Christian Democrat Party, and she quoted this quotation of how this was going to lead to selfishness and individual rights, and that was scary because she didn't understand how young people thought that just because you weren't in love that you could get a divorce, and they wanted to tackle that, and she just thought it led to all these horrible things. And that's what we started to see. So in northern and central Italy, a lot of women began to postpone marriages. They were getting married at a later age in life rather than a younger age, like prior to the 60s. More women were having one child, and that was also being postponed, or no child at all. And then you also have more babies being born out of wedlock and abortions. And then divorce just became modernized. It wasn't really frowned upon anymore. And the church started to see these values transform. So in 1970, the law came into place about the whole thing with the marriage, and how you couldn't remarry after divorce. They got rid of that in 1970. And in 1972, the Catholic Christian Democratic Party, they came in and they tried to repeal that, and it failed. So they were really freaking out because they were seeing this whole entire family unit dismantle, and they weren't really understanding, and they did not like individual freedom being granted to especially women, and them being able to take control. And that was what was happening. That was the change that came along, was because the women's suffrage movement was so powerful, and it granted women globally now in certain, globalization you could see in certain countries, that they were given rights, and that they had more power and just this new avenue of life. And that trickled to Italy. So the older generations really had a problem with that, where the younger generations did not. So I feel like this is important to American culture because it really allows the individual rights and equal rights of both men and women to continue to thrive and flourish. It's another culture that has adopted this new modern day of looking at things, and it just grants more individual rights. And yes, family is important, but now there isn't a law telling you how to live your life, or how fast you need to reproduce, or how fast you need to get married. Arranged marriages are really out the door. And I think that, is a great contribution to America, because that's something that we practice, right? So that culture is adapting, whereas gypsy cultures that live in the US, I know they're really strong still on not marrying outside of your culture. I know they're really strong still on women having to stay home and not go to school. And so that structure of lifestyle was really how Italian culture was back in the day, with, arranged marriages and wedlock only, and women kind of being in a place of control. So this contributes to break that as well. And there's a quote here I wanted to go over. Okay, yeah, it's this quote just says, compared to most Western European countries, divorce rates in Italy remained low, and cohabitation without marrying did not emerge as a strong phenomenon. So it wasn't as if also, marriage was out and Italy's having a hard time reproducing. I feel like the Catholic Church really just blew this crazy fear out of proportion, and the statistics still show that they're doing fine. Marriages are still there and babies are still being born, but we're also able to have individual freedoms and rights as women, especially with our reproductive rights and who we choose to marry and when. We can have the best of both worlds. So I think that this was beautiful that this happened, this effect of globalization, because it shows us that we can have it, and that the regions are much bigger than we seem to remember sometimes. So that is all, and thank you for watching.